How long will the standoff last? This statue in Trafalgar Square of early 20th century figures comments on British colonial rule, but the turned backs and power dynamics speak to this moment too. Workers versus their employers, government versus unions. Britain is heading into a whirlwind of strike action.
Has there been enough dialogue, do you think, between the government and different unions?
I mean, there's been plenty of dialogue, but they're not actually listening to each other.
I am worried about it because we're on holiday from Australia and we've got a lot of plans to travel around. So, yeah, I'm a bit worried about it because it's going to disrupt us quite a bit.
Is there any one particular strike that you're concerned about?
I would say nurses and paramedics, because that's crucial. It's life-threatening, isn't it? But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? You've got to live.
The nursing union is calling for a 5% pay rise above inflation. The General Secretary says she'll press pause on the strikes if the Health Secretary agrees to serious negotiations.
The one day of action that nurses are going to take on Thursday hasn't created the 7.2 million people sitting on our waiting lists. What sort of a state would it be in if we didn't have those nurses working the additional unpaid hours they do, working every hour they can get in their day? And what are we doing with those people? We're paying them the lowest possible wage we can.
The government hasn't changed its position.
We value incredibly what they're doing. But ultimately, we have got to make sure that the economics work. The nurses received a pay award last year when much of the rest of the public sector did not. And Steve Barclay has met with the union leaders. But ultimately, the independent pay review body has made a recommendation, and the government has decided to accept and implement that recommendation in full.
Strikes continue through the Christmas period, with key workers taking action on multiple days. Nurses have planned industrial action on the 15th and 20th of December. That's in parts of England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Whilst rail workers have proposed strikes on the 13th, 14th, 16th and 17th, as well as Christmas Eve to the 27th of December, and then from the 3rd, 4th and 6th to the 7th of January. UK Border Force will do the same from the 23rd to Boxing Day and then from the 28th to New Year's Eve. And for Royal Mail, it'll be the 14th, 15th and 23rd to the 24th of December. Today, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary said the NHS must reform or die, calling for unions to put patients first. His plan? Double the number of medical school training places and get in extra staff, funded by abolishing the non-dom tax status. On the imminent strike plans, he's accused the government of reckless behaviour for refusing to negotiate.
The really disappointing thing this morning is that the unions have said we will suspend strike action if you're prepared to talk to us about pay, and Steve Barclay and the government are saying they won't.
There's a lot on people's minds, cost of living particularly, and Christmas. The fight for higher pay for some is the fear of travel mayhem and NHS disruption for others.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Steve Brine, who is chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. This strike, it could be really, really damaging for the NHS and the people who use it. And all the government has to do to stop it is turn up and talk pay with the nurses. Why won't the government do it?
Well, I wouldn't accept that premise for a start. I mean, I would say it's been a good day for the RCM. I mean, to use a painful analogy, they've converted the spot kick and it's 1-0 today because they've really put the ball back in the government's court. It's not all that has to happen to avert these strikes is to say, well, come in for a chat. At the end of the day, you've got to have a... Yes, but you've got to have a meaningful chat about pay, haven't you? Now, we have, and I made this point in the House of Commons this week, we have an independent pay review body process in this country. Now, I'm not, that is something that I thought we believed in. Are we saying that we only believe everything's agreed until it's not agreed, and then we basically just go back to a sort of month on month, or are we saying we want to reform the independent pay process to sort of have an inflation ratchet, whereas every time inflation goes up, it goes up? That's then an unfunded spending promise and a blank check for the government. So I can see the bind that they're in, but I would suggest that they've really got not very little to lose by talking to the RCN. Otherwise, because they are playing in the court of public opinion here, and people are desperately worried. We on the Select Committee are desperately worried. We're going to have the ambulance.
Let me ask you this, because does anyone other than the government have the power to sanction further pay to the nurses?
Well, the independent pay review process does. They recommended newly qualified nurses 5.5% pay rise, some of the lowest paid porters, cleaners, a 9.3% pay rise on top of a 3% last year when public sector pay was frozen. So they have the power to do it within the remit set by the government. If that is going to change out of that cycle, then I understand why Steve Parris from the NHS today is saying we don't have the power to do that, because ultimately it is public money and therefore it comes from the Treasury. So
and the remit,
I suspect
the remit you mentioned for the Independent Pay Review Board, the remit you mentioned is set by the government, and they basically say to this Independent Pay Review Board, it's got to be affordable or we'll have to cut other things. So they come up with a figure. The nurses have rejected that figure. Surely the only way out of this now is for the government to go to the negotiating table.
I would agree, but then what we're then saying is that we don't believe in an independent pay review process, because everything is agreed until it's not, and basically we follow inflation. Now, okay, that's what we're saying. Well, then we have to fund that. But the only people that can fund that are government. The NHS can't fund that. So what we on the Select Committee, we can't get into pay negotiations on the Select Committee. What we can do is get into how safe care is provided, which is why we'll have all the ambulance chiefs in next Tuesday, and we are constantly talking to the NHS and the unions about how they, so Operation Willow, how they provide safe across integrated care systems, safe care throughout this winter period. That is what we can do to scrutinise. But ultimately, you are right that pay comes from the government chequebook, and the government chequebook is held by the government.
Well, it's interesting you say that you want the government to get to the table. Should they revisit other talks then? Because we've got all sorts of unions, all sorts of workers walking out. It doesn't reflect great on the government, does that, briefly?
Well, look, the government is not the employer in the train strikes, for instance. It is partly the employer in this instance. It's not across all of the industrial relations that you had there on your clever graphic. The government is not the employer in all those cases.
Okay.
You know, you can't solve the postal worker strike. But where it can, I think it has to pull out all the stops, because the public expect that.